Yes, sir. Understood, sir. I'll let them know. Agent Dreyers couldn't help but let an annoyed sigh escape. The authority on the other end must have noticed and said something else too, to which Dreyers replied, Yes, sir. I know what was out of our hands, both for the hearing and any additional materials or follow-up. He paused, listening to the other voice. I don't think they'll be thrilled, but they'll probably take it in stride like they've done with the other setbacks. A pause. Yes, sir. We'll be ready if anything changes. Yep, you have a good weekend too. Then he ended the call, this time letting out a much more forceful sigh as he rubbed his temples. Their department was certainly not the one in charge of determining when information about their visitors became public knowledge, but Dreyers couldn't help but feel cynical in his private opinion about the poor handling of it all. They had been through this song and dance just a few years earlier, with a soft launch using the Air Force dossiers to confirm the existence of UFOs. It was something that should have made front-page headlines for weeks, or, at the very least, a single news cycle. But now it was relegated to a sidebar of physical newspapers and digested into brief, flavorless summaries interspersed with video snippets of the hearings online. Their team wasn't an especially large one anymore, as their visitors were surprisingly low maintenance. Dreyers was one of only half a dozen tasked full-time with monitoring them and attending to their needs. He was also the only one on site, a fact he was painfully reminded of as he stepped out of his office. The somewhat cramped rooms and cubicles in the office space that had been set aside were thoroughly mothballed, all electronics and personal effects from those who once excitedly worked alongside him, having been removed decades ago. Agent Dreyers could feel the weight of memories pressing down on him for a moment. His throat felt stiff and a tear formed at the wrinkles at the side of his eye as he remembered how excited they'd been when they were young, when the visitors had first arrived. First made contact, first been established. The office had been filled with notes and images, discussions and jokes, and discovery after discovery as they managed to open communications and then actual visitations with their off-world guests. But that was then, and this was now. He still met up with the old crew on occasion for drinks and billiards when he was shoreside, but that was a fairly scarce opportunity. It had been more frequent before his wife Glenda had passed. Now that she had been gone 3 years, he rarely came to shore except for resupplies and the department-wide holiday dinner. He shrugged on a heavy coat and waterproof pants before exiting the office space and stepping out onto the deck of the rig. The office was a semi-converted space atop a functional oil platform, one that was a low enough producer that any self-respecting fuel company would have shuttered it years ago, though it produced enough to at least provide a reasonable cover story. If other nations suspected why the rig had truly been established and what really lay beneath, there had been no sign of it to their department. Still, Dreyers was careful to ensure that the heavy rain jacket and pants he wore covered his suit and tie just to keep up appearances. He waved greetings to a few of the rig workers he recognized as he walked past and saw yet more faces he did not recognize. This was fairly typical. While he was occasionally invited to a group dinner or to play a few hands of poker, Dreyers had never been an especially personable man and tended to shy away from such gatherings instinctively. He reached the chamber with the diving bell. Eager to be out of the heavy coat, he carefully doffed it and hung it on a waiting rack by the door. The diving bell chamber had 2 entrances. This one was labeled from the outside as a maintenance panel access and was generally ignored by the rest of the crew, allowing him to store what effects he needed within for his duties. He gathered a small briefcase of effects and quickly freshened up to make sure he was presentable as the representative of the United States and humanity at large. As he checked his teeth in the mirror, his eyes fell upon his service pistol sitting on the side of the sink, still in its shoulder holster, with a light film of dust on top. While technically required issue every time he went down, Dreyers had found it wholly unnecessary, in his opinion, and likely to raise questions that need not be answered. He had purposefully neglected to bring it with him ever since. Stepping into the diving bell, he secured the latches, checking to ensure the indicator light confirmed good seals. He took a key from the lanyard in his pocket, inserting it into the fire and emergency crew contact slot. He cranked it past off, past on, past call, and to an unmarked 4th position before pressing the descend button. There was a familiar lurch, his stomach rising into his throat for a moment, as it always did when the diving bell hurtled downwards. There was a rough thump as it met the water, but nothing beyond that. The descent was otherwise smooth. He noticed his ears popping slightly, a somewhat concerning indication of the diving bell's age and its inability to fully keep out the crushing pressure all around. Still, the bell continued downward, past the maintenance points on the rig and the drill shaft as well. It traveled for nearly another mile before slowing and coming to a stop. Peering out the porthole, he was pleased to see that, as always, despite the crushing darkness around him, there was a softly lit tunnel marked by pulsing glows leading out from the diving bell's sealed bulkhead door. He cranked the bulkhead loose, pushing the hatch open and being buffeted by a puff of warm air. To his surprise, the air was scented to a cloying and nauseating level of vanilla. No doubt they had been baking again. He would have to confirm with them that the ingredients they were using were the proper admixtures. From the smell of it, they had substituting the quantity of vanilla called for in a recipe with the exact weight of pure vanillin compound, synthesized using their own equipment, instead of the normal amount diluted in a carrier liquid. It wasn't the first time they had made that type of mistake, while fortunately nothing had been dangerous as a result of their attempts to make human food. It was almost always wholly unappetizing, and he had to put on his best face to pretend it was acceptable, if not necessarily delightful. He stepped down the softly lit hall, marveling again at the transparent view above. It was all pitch black, of course, but occasionally there'd be a flicker of reflected light as a small fish or squid darted past. In some cases, he had even seen one bump directly into the tunnel and stun itself for a few seconds before swimming away. Stepping up to the open hatchway, he rapped on the side of the metal door with his knuckles, calling, "Hello? Anybody home?" From within came the sing-song voices he had come to know so well. "Agent Dreyers, please come in. We welcome you into our home." The latter expression was still somewhat stiff and formal, as the aliens were doing their best to mimic human phrasing. Even after all these decades, they still hadn't quite gotten the hang of inflection. He stepped in, ducking low to avoid hitting his head on the curved ceiling. The overall size of the ship was fairly small, perhaps comparable to a 2- or 3-bedroom house, but the living quarters here were scarcely larger than a studio apartment. The two aliens approached to greet him, and Agent Dreyers felt his heart clench in sympathy for them. They resembled the traditional Roswell alien description, albeit with hexagonal compound eyes set higher on their heads, resembling those of a dragonfly. Their arms split at the elbow into a pair of hands and forelimbs. Both were wearing baggy t-shirts that read, "Welcome, Humanity," and they beamed as they noticed him. "What do you think?" "We had these delivered in secret," they said, smiling and giving a quick hand covering the eye gesture, their way of mimicking a wink since they had no eyelids. Agent Dreyers chuckled, smiling sadly. "They do look nice. All right." The shirts weren't a surprise, though the aliens had tried to request them discreetly through the medical team. The doctor had appropriately informed Dreyers about the unusual order for silk-screen t-shirts, prompting him to review it just in case. "So, what's the news? Are humans excited to learn that we are here? What did they think? Are they coming soon?" He smiled, steeling himself. "I'm afraid that the reception has been less than enthusiastic." The broad smile on the alien's face faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" "Well, we held the hearing and told them that you aliens are indeed here and that you're under the ocean." "Excellent! Are there camera crews arriving soon then? What questions do they have for us? Are we to meet the president now?" They craned to look behind him, as if expecting there to be a silent crowd just out of sight. Agent Dreyers shook his head. "Unfortunately, it seems people still don't believe you exist." "But wasn't that the point of having the hearing?" one of them asked. Their smiles began to droop. Agent Dreyers nodded. Over the years, there had been some attempts to name the creatures, but their personalities appeared almost identical, and genetically, they were entirely identical. Their species didn't use personal nouns like names, and had instead requested to be referred to collectively. He shrugged. "Yeah, they did, but people just don't believe them." "Surely they showed them the pictures we have taken?" The alien thrust a disposable camera toward Agent Dreyer's. "We have taken many more. We hope they will be informative and useful for the humans who wish to learn about us." Dreyers nodded, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Yes, I'll make sure to pass that along." But no, they didn't include images this time either. There had already been hundreds of images captured for the hearing, but none had been presented, much to his grave disappointment. Poor or altogether missing visuals had been one of the reasons the initial UFO hearing had been received so poorly, and he was already seeing and hearing that the reaction was much the same even to the confirmation presented in the most recent hearing. "We believe these will be of great use to the humans. It even shows us making these." The alien held out a tray of cookies still cooling, reeking of vanilla so strongly that Agent Dreyer's eyes started to water. "Those look great," he said hesitantly. The aliens beamed. "Yes, we are excited for you to try them once they are cool enough to be safe to consume." He grinned and gave a thumbs up, his stomach already doing flips at the thought. He took the offered disposable camera, tucking it into his jacket, knowing it would end up next to the other dozen filled cameras still sitting in his office desk drawer. The cost of developing traditional film had become a significant problem. It had been decided early on that giving the aliens a digital camera might pose too great a technological risk, so they were supplied only with disposable ones. However, developing the film had turned into a logistical nightmare over the past decade, as most government-secure development facilities had been shuttered one by one. Theoretically, there was a site in Kansas that was still operational, but its backlog, primarily old U2 surveillance footage, stretched for miles. As a result, the disposables had been relegated to a maybe sometime next year. "ETA. We had been so hopeful to meet you all," said one alien, coming up to hug Agent Dreyers before he could politely but firmly request they refrain from doing so. As the alien sniffled and broke the embrace, Dreyers withheld a groan of frustration at seeing the imprint of the alien sweat along his suit coat and pants. Their species didn't cry, but still had biological processes to flush stress chemicals, resulting in a form of sweat-like paste exuding from all over their head. It wasn't the hug he minded so much as the dry cleaning it always required, and the hefty bribe to the laundromat to not question why such harsh chemicals were needed to fully remove the stain.